Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Viewers, today we will be talking something which cannot be cherished, which give us a pain, but to learn and to correct our future course of actions and the policies, we have to discuss such incidents. We will be talking about the World War II, so where the millions of people have been killed at the name of values, at the name of economic interest, or whatever. But the millions of people have been killed. We will be talking about the Japanese aggression against Chinese people, how the Japanese army, with the order of the royals, they killed millions of Chinese people. There are different estimates. Some people say 10 million Chinese were killed, some says the 15 million, and others says the 20 million. So whatever the number, but the people were killed. And the Japanese forces used all atrocities. They used the germ warfare, they used the traditional war tactics to kill the Chinese people. In this context, we have requested a very well known scholar who has produced some good material, some podcasts, and had also written some articles on the subject. So, what role China played in the World War II and how the Japanese aggression has created vast human massacres in China. Miss Dao Hongo, she is also a podcast host with the CGTN. CGTN is a global television network of China, which is taking the Chinese message to the world. And she is also a reporter and a journalist. Thank you, Miss Dao, for joining us.
Thank you.
No,
It's great to be here.
no, let's start with our conversation. So, when we look at the history, so which is not mostly told in our in our media, especially in the Western media, the role of China. China played a very, when I look at the history, China played a very important role to defeat the fascist governments and the fascist forces. So can you enlighten our viewers a little bit how China play a role in the Second World War and what was that role?
Well, first, I think one important point we need to make is that although we talk about World War II, when we talk about it, we mainly talk about the one in late 1930s and in early 1940s, but the fight against fascism started way earlier than that. In 1931, Japan had already started its aggression into China, and China took its guns, its weapons to fight back. For example, early in September 1931, the Japanese army, the Kwantung Army, blew up a section of railway in China's northeastern Shenyang city, and then it forcefully accused Chinese soldiers of doing it. Then they used this as an excuse, as a pretext to launch their attack against the Chinese army. At first, the Chinese Kuomintang government used this non-resistance policy. But then very soon, two of the three northeastern provinces in China fell one by the other. And then when the Japanese moved into the third province in northeastern China, the Heilongjiang province, the General Ma Zhanshan, who was the acting governor of the province, decided not to give it to the Japanese without a fight. So he led his men to took up their weapons and fired a fierce attack, counterattack against the Japanese aggression. But that gave the Chinese people a lot of confidence. It was the first time that the Chinese people realized that the Japanese army was could be defeated. We could use our power to
That's a
attack
very
them too.
important. That's very important when
Yeah.
people have this confidence, so your enemy can be defeated. That was a very good learning.
Yes, and then in this July, I visited the area when where Ma led his troops to defend. There was a villager who lives there, and he's the son of a soldier who fought against the Japanese in during the 1930s, and he's preserving an old newspaper. And that newspaper, there's a whole piece of advertisement about a cigarette brand. And on the advertisement, there's a huge portrait of General Ma, and it reads, everyone in the country should learn from General Ma Zhanshan and defend our motherland. And for every box of cigarette, we would donate 10 yuan to the war efforts. So you can see that the defense and the counterattack has become something that Chinese civilization, the Chinese civilians realized and something important to do. So it was not just about the soldiers, the army, but the Chinese people realized the importance of fighting back. So China's fight against fascism started early in 1931, but this kind of battle is
And
quite lopsided.
at that time,
Mhm.
the world was not very much aware about so what Japanese forces are doing and what type of the pain the Chinese people are suffering.
Indeed. So even today, there's still not much voices talking about these. And
Why
even
it is
when
so? Why it is so? Because there has been written a lot about the World War II. Then the Chinese story is missing from there.
I believe maybe the root cause is that we're now living in a narrative mainly guided by the Western media, the Western countries, and they are highlighting their roles in the World War II, which leads to the current international arena. So they're trying to make the Chinese stories on the battlefield disappear and try to highlight their contributions. But that is not a objective and correct way of seeing that part of history. So it's important for us to tell those stories to people.
And other thing is, which whenever I look at the history, not only China, the USSR role has been also eliminated. The two allies of World War II has been abandoned, raided. They declared the enemies of the Western powers. So, anyways, when we look at the Chinese side and the data, so the Chinese were fighting. So, what was the major difficulties Chinese forces faced in the beginning?
I think one of the major difficulties is the disparities in the military powers between these two nations. You know, back then, Japan was already an industrial country, but China was an agricultural country, which was far from industrialization or modernization. So this battle was obviously lopsided. So that's what made the Chinese defense very, very difficult. And the second is that many people still thought that China was fighting a losing battle, so that there might be different voices. So back then it was very difficult to arise people's confidence and their ambition to defend their nations.
And there are different stories which tell how the Japanese forces were conducting the atrocities. And there's a special story, I think, from Shandong, where where the Japanese forces did a vast level killing. So, what was that incident?
Well, that is indeed one of the darkest chapters in human history regarding the events, including Nanjing Massacre and what the Japanese army did in the Unit 731, which includes human experiments and biological warfare. They were used not only to attack Chinese army, but also to reduce people's will to defend. For example, in the Unit 731, which was based in northeastern China's city of Harbin, they were secretly conducting experiments on conscious human beings. They were captured Chinese civilians and Chinese soldiers, and they also include some people from the Soviet Union and from North Korea. They were they were inside and they were being conducted with experiments such as they were first get infected with diseases and then their organs were taken out when they were still conscious without anesthesia. We can simply not imagine the fear and the trauma and the screaming at the time. And then the Japanese army used those experiments they used the results to cultivate more like more germs that can cause people to die. And they use them in the battlefield in eastern China, like the cities of Ningbo and Lishui. Then they spread those bacteria, and then those bacteria would cause a huge area of death in those areas. So the people and the army didn't have the ability to get involved in the counterattack. And I also interviewed a descendant of the warfare victim, and he said some of the survivors still living today, they're suffering from wounds that never heal. There's a lot of terrible smells. There's a lot of pains and itching. They cannot put on pants. They cannot wear shoes. They cannot visit their relatives because they smell terribly. They wear the loss of dignity, the shame, for their whole life until their death. But they haven't got any official apologies from the invaders.
You're
So
talking
that
about
is why,
the apology. I heard so Japanese are not ready to accept it. They are not accepting it. They did anything wrong like that. The germ warfare.
Mhm. Because they are trying to first establish an outside image of a peaceful country, and they're trying to edit this part of history. So I think the root cause is that they don't want to admit the atrocities because they don't want to shoulder such responsibilities. And the deeper cause is this mindset that they didn't fully accept the fact that this is wrong, I believe. So maybe one day, if they could become strong enough, if they thought it was time to commit a crime again, they would still do it. I think it is because they haven't fully understand what they did wrong, so they're not willing to admit it. And to admit such atrocities is not good for their own benefits.
I disagree with you. Yeah, they fully understand what they did. But I think they are the political preferences, like they are the political bodies. They are visiting those tombs where the criminals are being buried, and they are hegemonic aspirations. It's a just matter of times when again the Japan will get all these resources. They will behave like that. What I foresee. So, but they understand. Let's moving to the next. So after this germ warfare, so what the international rules apply on Japan? And China should also seek those international rules to be applied on China.
What do you mean by the international rules? Like the
And
Tokyo
definitely,
trial?
like they are the international obligations, so that if you commit some crime, the war crimes, the germ crimes, so you have to pay for that and you have to apologize. So can China take the Japan to the international court or other institution to apologize and get these all people be compensated?
Well, actually, there are already a lot of Chinese civilians who are trying to do this over the past decades, but they haven't succeeded on the courts of Tokyo. The Tokyo rejected their accusations a few times for different reasons, but none of those, including those on the Tokyo trial, really admitted those crimes. And the leading scientists and the officials in the Unit 731, many of them lived quite a good life afterwards in the United States or in Japan. So we will still wait and see whether China will officially do that accusation. But there are already Chinese civilians who carried lots of evidence from the victims, from the descendants of victims to the court, but they haven't succeeded.
Do you think China should publish the names of criminals and make it public on the global level so people can understand who is a war criminal and who is where is those are hiding and which country is protecting them?
Well, I believe no matter whether China would do it, there are already lists of the criminals on the internet in documentaries. There's a lot of information about that. But I think what the world is doing is that right after World War II, first the United States they have some exchange deals with the United States to use the results of their experiments and then help to cover their atrocities. Some of them
Okay,
offered
those were they
good.
made a deal with US to share the results with the US so US can also apply somewhere.
Yes, that's part of the action of covering the atrocities, including the bombing of the old site of Unit 731. And the exchange of data is also part of the covering. So that is also why it is extremely difficult for us to reveal the atrocities of Unit 731 in biological warfare.
There is a very important question. China and US were allied during the World War II. And it means from behind the scene, they were also cooperating with the Japan to continue their atrocities.
I'm not saying that they're helping Japan to do live human experiments during World War II. I'm saying that after the war, when the new world order is being established, Western countries are doing for their own benefits, but not for their allies, like China. So what they were doing was trying to get those data for their own benefits. After the wartime, it's quite different. It's in another narrative.
So, but crime remains a crime. You cannot justify the crime and the criminals. So that's me, you are betraying your ally. Anyways, moving forward. So if we look at the war, World War II, the Chinese people did not only fight for its motherland, but also to protect the other country, other soldiers from other countries, like the Burma incident. Can you little bit share with the audience how the Chinese forces helped to save the lives of the British soldiers and journalists and other human rights watchers?
Well, as far as I know, the Chinese civilians and villagers tried to help England, the British soldiers who were fought by the Japanese on the ship in Dongji Island. I think that is not a totally government-led action. It was purely out of like human connections and sympathy. So that is a great example of how humanities took its role during difficult times.
Thank you, Ms. Dov. We have some information about what the Japanese were doing. So one thing we shared very clearly about the germ warfare. And I think after your interview, if our audience is listening, they will come to know that Japan, who is portraying itself something else, but they have committed so much heinous crime in the history. So what you see in the coming years, because again the world is going through the sharp changes, we can see the politics in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and there is differences over different islands. So what Japan can do. So world must be aware of that. Our world be able to prevent Japan to commit such atrocities again.
Yes, all of the events you mentioned always remind us that colonialism and militarism and the mindset of fascists haven't really disappeared. They're always growing secretly and they're always ready to come out when the world is not that peaceful, when the economy is bad, when there are instabilities. So what we need to do is first to never forget about those atrocities and to never forget about history, especially to try to tell those unheard stories that are trying to be hidden by some narratives. And
That is very
second,
important. The stories you have to tell. Otherwise, people will not come to know.
yes, it's especially for young people to get to know about them because as time passes by, the young people will get lesser and lesser know about those history, which is quite dangerous. And second, I think it is everybody's responsibility, I mean, each country's responsibility to defend our current multilateral system so that the hegemony, the militarism, and fascism will not grow up again, such as the global initiatives that China proposed, like the Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative, which call for a fair and common development of all nations in the world, no matter whether you're strong or whether you're weak. You can all develop based on your own features and characteristics. This is important because when there's a balanced development in the world, it's very difficult for fascism to grow up again. If fascism comes back again, any one of us could be a victim, and we don't want to
Yes.
see it. So it's important for the multilateral international system to defend the peace and economic development together.
Thank you, Ms. Dow, for your wonderful commentary on the history of Japanese aggression against China and the Chinese role in the World War II. I think what you said earlier, telling the story is very important. And the President Xi
Yes.
Jinping, while visiting the Chinese media group and a few years back, he also mentioned that tell the Chinese story in a forceful way. I think now it's a time to tell the Chinese story in a forceful way to the world to show so what these the so-called civilized and the liberal economy countries did to the humanity and how much China suffered at the hand of the Japanese fascism. And people like you can do that and take the lead. Because I strongly believe after listening your interview, many people will come to know what really happened, especially about the germ warfare. So these interviews are these things I strongly propose must continue to tell the story. Thank you, Ms. Dow.
Thank you. It's my honor.